Chapter 3 of Psychopomp Drive. Written by Janeen Leese-Taylor. Read aloud by Skaya Simaru. Chapter 3 Through the Door. The mysterious doorway led out into a long, dark cul-de-sac that was lined with rows of quiet matching bungalows, all tucked together like pairs of sleeping twins. Between each of the buildings, Finley could see an almost imperceptible light-colored smoke, which caressed their outer walls like a phantom's hands. The bright but rainy afternoon had long since given into the dark, heaving pressure of nighttime, and the stars shone overhead like disco lights in the absence of the usually intrusive street lamps. The houses along either side of them burned brightly from within, the shadows of the moving inhabitants playing on their curtains like a wayang purwa puppet show. Finley froze in place as he came across the threshold, turning to glance back the way that they had come. The door behind them sealed shut and faded into the night again, leaving a vast and empty street in its wake. In the distance, a car pulled into one of the driveways, the sound of its engine calming to a gentle homecoming hum.
What is this place?"
he asked softly. The black cat walked a little ways ahead of him, tail held high in a confident straight line as he hopped up onto the curb.
Just an ordinary street,"
he answered. Finley twisted back to watch him with a frown.
"I don't understand," he said. "Why did that door bring us out here?"
The spirit turned its head.
"The in-between is not so different from your own plane of existence," he explained. "Think of it as a layer above the world you know, like a sheet across a table. The living occupy the space directly on top of the table, while we walk the world through a thin sliver of fabric. It's like experiencing the world through a pane of glass."
Finley's eyes were pulled towards movement outside one of the houses. A man sitting on a bench by the front porch, the cascade of his cigarette smoke glowing like embers in the LED streetlight, as bright as the stars above them in the blackness.
Does that mean no one can see us here?"
His companion gave him a feline smile.
"The living will only see what they expect to see. A passing shadow in the corner of their eye, a flash of déjà vu. The mind is an incredible tool for filling in the blanks."
The houses on either side of them were a calming sight, as Finley followed the little spirit through the estate. Their gardens were neat and green and identical, with soft blue fence surrounds. The darkness of twilight had tinged the grass with white and purple tones, ornamental gnomes guarding the fringes of the small properties. He followed closely as the cat veered off to one side, slipping through the tiny divides between the houses. Finley angled himself to one side, tucking in his shoulders as best he could to squeeze into the space. He could feel the ivy overhead brushing against the tips of his hair. They were as damp and cold as a winter's touch. On the other side of the alleyway was a large space of green that served as a public park for the estate. Rusted iron bars still held disused swings in their embrace, and the painted faces of smiling animals perched atop coiled red springs. The bungalows formed a semicircle on the south side, with trees coiled around the north to close in the remainder of the gaps. Perfectly enclosed, The space appeared to have fallen into disrepair in the years following its construction.
Why are we in an old park?
The human asked, glancing around the metal foundations. They were wet with the recent rain, the paint peeled back by years of moisture and frost.
Come and see,
the cat invited, making his way through the playground to a singular metal structure on the far side. Amongst the piles of dirt and building supplies stood a single non-functioning water fountain. As Finley walked closer, he was able to see coins of different values twinkling beneath the surface of the lying water.
It looks like an old wishing well,
he commented, peering inside. Some half-buried habit made the man pat the spaces where the pockets of his jeans had been.
You're not far off, Finley Evans,
the small spirit replied as he came to stand next to him.
You may wish to take a step back, though. You're dangerously close to the splash zone.
The splash zone? Ah! Finley repeated, then jumped as the fountain burst to life with a rush of sound. Clear water flooding out of the old pipes. Twin funnels of water shot up into the air, and the blonde-haired man stared in awe as water gushed around the structure with a pained hiss. The tiles began to file off the fountain, one by one, forming row after row beneath their feet like a bricked pathway. Finley took several steps backwards as the tiles each slotted into place. The rest of the water feature opened up to reveal steps down into the darkness of the underground and the fountain's complex inner workings. Hovering at the entranceway, the cat lifted his head to regard his human partner.
Welcome to Psychopomp Drive.
Finley rested a hand against the cold tiles, peering down into the darkness below. He could hear water dripping inside, and a smell like the sour tang of chlorine rose from within, like he was entering the maw of some great-toothed serpent.
What is this place?
A mimic of his own voice called back to him from the emptiness. The cat darted ahead, his black fur disappearing out of sight in an instant.
"Follow me and find out,"
he hollered. The wet sound of his footfalls vanished into the ether. Tracing his fingertips along the shimmering tiles, Finley slowly lowered himself down the rows of concealed steps. He shuddered as the air grew noticeably colder beneath the surface of the earth. There was something else there, too. A faint sense of otherworldliness that settled in the center of his gut like a heavy iron ball. He swallowed, ducking his head as he entered the narrow corridor beyond. The walls were damp and tiled, grass and moss growing in tufts between the intricate mosaic designs.
Yo, Mr. Cat, where exactly did you say that we were going?"
Before him, the space opened up into a wide, well-lit cavern with high ceilings and damp, glistening walls the color of wet sand. Algae made every surface appear clammy, and Finley quickly retracted his hand when he felt the unfamiliar squelch of it beneath his fingers. Fairy lights twinkled from where they hung from the natural ebbs and hollows of the cave, reflecting yellow light off the trickling rivers of water as they made their way under their feet and into the deep valley below. Dense purple ferns carpeted the ceiling, buzzing with insect life. The soft melody of bird song floated lackadaisically on the slow-moving air.
This feels like a really peaceful place,
Finley thought. Something about the cavern made his shoulders finally drop down from their previous spot around his ears. He exhaled a long, slow breath as he proceeded, his feet finding their forward momentum on the stone. He could hear the voice of his animal guide as he rounded the next corner, and he picked out his dark shape amongst the pale rocks. He was looking up, talking to someone just out of sight. The stranger was answering back in a low baritone, the rumble of his voice making the very rocks beside him tremble. When Finley drew nearer, stepping over several broken pieces of shale, he was surprised to find that the individual the cat was talking to wasn't a man at all. From the chest down, the creature appeared humanoid in nature, with dark skin and an elegantly cut three-piece suit the color of red wine. But his features told the story of a different beast entirely. 2 tall black ears formed points above his head, and his face had a long, canine quality to it. His fur was the crisp blackness of a well-loved onyx stone, his eyes as deep as the gurgling river that had worn out rivets in the wall next to him. An elegantly crafted wooden boat bobbed there, waiting patiently for use. Small pockets of air rose to the surface around it, popping quietly in the background. The stranger twisted his canine face to inspect him as he emerged from the side tunnel, a smile beginning its journey across his long jaw. "Ah, and here he is," he noted. He had an accent, something Arabic with a distinctly French tone to it. It was as smooth and melodic as the echo of the singing birds nestled in against the stone walls. Finley's green eyes dipped towards his shorter, feline companion and back up again. He started hesitantly. He met the creature's dark eyes and swallowed down his nerves, sticking out his hand reflexively. I'm Finley Evans," he said. "Nice to meet you." The jackal-headed man chuckled. It was a low, attractive sound, like waves crashing against the side of a boat on a calm day. He extended his own hand and accepted the greeting with obvious amusement. "Humans always surprise me," he remarked. "It is a pleasure to meet you, Finley Evans. I am Lord Anubis." "Anubis?" Finley thought. "Wait, I've heard that name somewhere before." In the back of his mind, a long-lost memory began to resurface, of a primary 5 class and a teacher that went by the name Mr. Farthing. Amongst the mental sediment that had accumulated in the years since, Finley found that his teacher had been a bit of a history buff, a bespectacled man with short cropped hair. His enthusiasm had been as infectious as a yawn or an itch. "You're the Egyptian god of the afterlife," Finley realized. He remembered the feel of wet papier-mâché on his hands, the way he had worked the awkward material into the shape of a snout for his makeshift funeral mask. Anubis gave him a toothy grin, something bright passing across his eyes. "As I said, humans are always a delight." His tone suggested that he was pleased to be recognized. A thin black tail was wagging at his back, whipping the air. The cat nudged against Finley's ankles to get his attention. "Anubis and Charon are psychopomps, guides and grims that work the in-between like myself," he explained. "Their job is to help guide the recently deceased to their chosen afterlife." "Chosen afterlife?" Finley questioned. turning his attention back towards the man in the suit.
You get to choose where you go when you die?
In a manner of speaking,
Anubis replied.
we try to make the transition into death as comfortable as possible.
You kind of sound like a travel broker,
the human noted.
When people die, many of them already have an idea of what to expect, a set of beliefs that they carry with them from the world of the living.
Anubis continued.
It is my job to ensure that their souls are returned to the place where they belong.
So, which afterlife is the real one?
The jackal snorted.
Why, Mr. Evans, they all are.
As Finley opened his mouth to speak again, the spirit at his feet knocked against the side of his leg.
There will be plenty of time for questions later, Finley. For now, we must get you back to the others.
The young man glanced down towards the spot by his right foot.
There are others?
You were my 8th and final life to give, Master Evans,
the cat-shaped Grim replied.
There are 7 other Grimmeke cats waiting to meet you in our chambers.
The cat with the starlight eyes turned to face his jackal companion again, waving goodbye with his long tail.
I wish you smooth sailing this evening, Anubis. Do send my regards to Charon when you see him.
Anubis bowed his head in response.
I shall. Enjoy your evening, Sadiki.
Finley watched as the jackal-headed man stepped down into his boat. It rocked gently from side to side, adjusting to his weight on the slow-moving stream. He gripped the end of the wooden barge pole with both hands, working it through the silt and clay to push the boat into motion. In only a few moments, the shape of the man disappeared out of sight. The sound of running water followed them as they made their way across the wide cavern, passing the strange multitudes of black wooden doors inlaid unnaturally against the stone. Copper-colored gears spun amongst the greenery overhead, and he could just about make out the rumble of quiet voices behind them. Despite the late hour, the spirits of Psychopomp Drive were awake and bustling.
I just realized,
Finley started, watching the cat as he walked ahead of him.
You never told me your name.
Salo,
the cat answered, glancing back at him with something like a smile. He passed another door, and his eyes turned towards it briefly, before discarding his interest and continuing on.
I don't really know anything about you,
Finley admitted, slowing to a stop.
All of this is insane, and I'm just following you.
He paused, squeezing his arms tightly around his body.
I don't even really know where it is you're taking me.
The little Grim stopped and twisted his dark body back to face him, sitting down on the pale, rocky floor.
Oh, apologies, Master Evans. I know this must be a lot to take in,
he answered patiently.
The place you are in now is called Psychopomp Drive. It's an underground network for all the spirits, gods, and grims that work in the in-between.
He hopped up onto one of the rocks next to him, bringing himself level with Finley's shoulders.
This is where all lives must go when they end. A kind of sorting center, if you will.
And my life,
Finley said.
Has it ended too?
Your mortal body is dead, Master Evans,
Saulo explained, his tone softening to match the other man's.
You are now what we call an amarini. It's taken from the term amarini mo hayaku shinda, meaning died too soon.
It was coined by an old Shinigami spirit from Tokyo. But my soul is still here, Finley pressed. That means I can go back, right? Back to my old life? Back to Thorn and... The old you is gone, Finley. Your body is in a morgue. Your family are grieving you.
Salo's bright eyes were kind, but his expression had hardened.
There is no going back.
The blonde-haired human shook his head.
No, you said... I said that you would be granted a second life. That is an opportunity for your soul, not for your body.
The Grim jumped down from the rock and proceeded to walk through the cavern ahead of them.
You have been given a chance to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, to protect those that are still living. But what about my family? What about my girlfriend?
The human's tone grew frantic. He took a step back and away from the Grim.
I was going to propose.
The last word barely worked its way around the lump in his throat.
There was so much I wanted to do, he thought. So much I didn't have the chance to say. I didn't even get to see Thorn one last time. Didn't get to walk her from work or get Elijah his coffee or...
The cat watched him wordlessly. In his eyes, entire galaxies came and went. Shooting stars danced 1,000 miles away. There was a sorrow there, a deep well of concealed emotion that he chose not to voice, but Finley felt the weight of it all the same. For a moment, the stone beneath his feet felt hollow, like he might fall through to the river beneath them and be carried away forever. He brought a hand slowly to his chest and took a hold of his shirt, squeezing it into a fist.
None of that matters anymore, does it? I'm so sorry, Finley.
Salo's voice was gentle, where it carried amongst the sound of gears and birdsong.
That story has already been written. The ink has dried. There is no changing it now.
Only 30 years old. His gravestone would read the words, "Gone from us too soon. A loving son." His name would be carved into a place he would never be. A place that would break Thorn's heart. Finley swallowed against the infinite tightness in his chest. He expected to cry, to feel the familiar burn of tears welling up in the corners of his eyes. But nothing came.
What if I'm not ready? No one ever is, Salo said. But death, like life, has a funny way of moving us along.
He carried on gracefully through the winding corridors of stone and curling roots, and Finley found himself on autopilot, following the motion of his dark tail amongst the twinkling of dew and fairy lights. Every step he took felt like the slow march behind his own hearse. He wondered what songs they would play to say goodbye to him, who they would invite to the service, whether his mum would read a poem or a paragraph of scripture. He had never been religious. Had he ever told anybody that? He had never taken the time to recite a will or to sign up for a donor card either. He had always thought that there would be more time. After a moment, Salo came to a stop at a tall red door, pausing to look back at him over one furry shoulder.
"This is us," he said. "This will be your new home going forward, Finley."
The blonde-haired man stopped before the door and allowed his eyes to take in the angles and bends of the strangely shaped dwelling. It had been built into the very walls of the cave. The red clay walls were covered with thick ropes of ivy. which crept down to conceal most of the entranceway from view. There was a golden metal plaque by one side of the door with the word 16 and XVI written in Roman numerals. Finley traced his fingertips across it.
How many other Amorini are there?
He asked.
There are hundreds of other spirits stationed throughout the in-between,
Salo told the man, studying his expression.
But in this house, there are only 7 others.
Finley looked back at the grim and chewed on his bottom lip.
You said they died just like I did,
he said thoughtfully, letting his eyes wander across the old stone.
What are they like? Come and see for yourself.
Salo beckoned as he dove for the bottom of the door. Concealed amongst the vegetation was a small, square cat flap. With a flash of black, Salo had disappeared inside, and Finley hesitated as he moved to join him, reaching out for the silvery door handle. He felt the cold metal press against the inside of his hand, and a jolt of adrenaline ran through him at the sensation.
This will be your new home going forward, Finley.
He didn't want a new home. He already had a home, back on the surface with Thorn and Poppy and her insane collection of houseplants and old vinyl records. This place, with its damp, cold walls and windowless edges, was not his home. He pushed the metal handle down and forced the door inwards, stepping into the glare of the electrical lights beyond. It looked like an ordinary living room, the walls painted white and lined with framed photographs of smiling strangers and their families. In the center of the space was an old yellow sofa with a matching armchair and love seat. Navy and gray cushions of various sizes covered the aging fabric. On the sofa, with his back to them, sat a tall man with dark, cropped hair that had been pushed back from his face. His skin was softly tanned, and his glasses glistened with light as he tilted his head towards the sound of the door. His eyebrows quirked upwards in surprise as 2 tufts of his hair appeared to shoot towards the ceiling. No, not hair. Ears. Amongst the neat strands of gelled black hair were 2 feline ears, just like Salo's. In the adjoining room, sitting under the glow of a yellow lantern, 3 forms were gathered at a kitchen table. They raised their heads, their conversation dying on their lips as they stared in his direction. On each of their heads were a similar set of small triangular ears. The eldest of the 3 got to her feet, her hands pressed firmly into the tabletop. Her skin was dark, like the leather-bound frame of a classic novel, her hair black with natural streaks of auburn that were accentuated by the overhead lights. Her eyes were black as night, questioning. She had a motherly quality to her appearance, a softness concealed behind her caution that took the form of a striped navy t-shirt and jeans. She glanced down towards the floor. "And who's this?" she questioned as she crossed her arms. She had the hints of an accent, something vaguely Mediterranean, though Finley was not well-traveled enough to place it. It was clipped and fast, the words bouncing off her tongue, more so than rolling. Saulo hopped up onto the back of the sofa next to the binoclard's head.
"Ah, Miss Lady, good evening. Are the others around?"
he asked. Another of the strangers at the table got to her feet. She was thin as a reed and tall with blonde hair that appeared almost colorless beneath the bright lights. Her eyes were an intelligent shade of green, and probed him as thoroughly as any X-ray. She couldn't have been much more than 25 years old. "They just got back from patrol," the girl answered, something of a Scottish twang infiltrating her words. "Need me to nap them for you, bossman?"
"If you wouldn't mind, Abigail,"
Sallow said with a nod.
"Ugh, I've told you it's Abby,"
the girl corrected him with an annoyed scoff as she rushed towards the stairs.
"Abigail makes me sound like my nan."
Finley listened as her footfalls disappeared noisily into the landing above. The dark-haired man on the sofa rose slowly to his feet and corrected his glasses where they had fallen down his long nose. He laid the book he was reading to one side, carefully splitting the spine to reserve his place in it.
"It appears as if we have a new guest."
He was well-spoken with a distinctly French accent. Although his long vowels softened his tone, it was clear that this new development made the man nervous. The shapes of 3 others appeared behind Abigail on the stairs, leaning over the banister to inspect their visitor with a collection of expressions ranging from curiosity to annoyance. A gruff, broad-shouldered man pushed through to clamber noisily into the living area. Dressed in an unusual array of colors and shapes, Finley couldn't help how his eyes were drawn to each item of clothing individually. As his mother would have once said, the man looked like he had dressed himself in the dark. He jutted his rough-ended pointer finger in the blond man's direction.
"After all this time, this is the soul you go with? Wirklich den killing."
He looked him up and down with a frown, waving his hands.
"He's barely 80 kilograms, blood-lagning vet."
"Alvaro,"
Sallow said sternly, attracting the Swede's attention.
"Please sit down so that we can make some introductions."
The man called Alvaro snorted and folded his arms stubbornly.
"Not until you answer our questions, Capture. Who is this guy?"
The third person at the table laid their head down behind the cover of their arms with an exasperated groan. A luminous blue dye flashed by in the shaved portion of their dark hair.
"Ugh, come on, Alvaro. Lighten up on the poor kid. He just got here."
The cat surveyed the assembled spirits carefully before he spoke next. Finley counted 7 people in the room, including the tall man, the group by the kitchen table, and a small, thin teenager who was perched on the end of one of the armchairs in the adjoining room. In appearance, they were as different as people came. Everything from their age and nationality to their choice of clothing made them stick out as a rather eclectic bunch.
"Everyone, I would like for you to meet the last of my Amarini,"
Sallow introduced as he sat next to him, his whiskers catching the light as he turned his head back to face their newest recruit.
"This is Finley Evans."
To be continued in Chapter 4.